Shalom from Jerusalem. My name is Albert Wexler. I'm the director of Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast. And we are here with answers for our allies. Israel is at war. We are experiencing some very difficult days. We've had some amazing support from our Western allies. I mean, the President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, they've been coming to Israel. It's actually the first American president that came during the war. We can see the solidarity visits of Bulgarian Prime Minister, President Macron of France, Chancellor Olaf Scholz, Greek Prime Minister, Prime Minister of United Kingdom, Sunak of Hungary, President Katalin Novak, Czech Prime Minister, Austrian Chancellor Karl Nehammer, and so on and so forth. Also, I need to mention the support from the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and the European Parliament President Roberta Metsola. At the same time, Israel is facing not just the war from the Gaza Strip with Hamas that was orchestrated by Iran, and the northern front is heating up. Hezbollah is basically allowing bombardment of Israel missiles. We see that the King of Jordan, Jordanian government, has been declaring red lines of war. And this is something that we have seen, that they will consider the expulsion of Palestinians from their territory as the declaration of war. So this is a difficult time. Definitely it's the time of Jacob's trouble. And we are here in the Friends of Zion Museum with Rabbi Chaim Eisen. Now, Chaim, you have been to Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast several times. You have been speaking in Houston, in Jerusalem, and also on our special reports here. And Israel, well, we didn't really call it a National Day of Prayer, but there was an attempt to call the November 6th as the Day of Prayer. 20 Knesset members signed on this initiative, and there was a big prayer meeting in the Grand Synagogue. And in Israel's history, I mean, I know King Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, all of them prayed, Ezra, Nehemiah, Daniel, but has there been really a tradition that Israeli government has called a day of prayer, like we know President Washington or Eisenhower or others did that during the times of war and difficulties?
Well, of course, it depends on what you mean by the Israeli government. That is the government of the nation of Israel. Unequivocally, you actually mentioned King Jehoshaphat, King Hezekiah. Those were governments of Israel, of course. And we certainly discern a venerable tradition in our history of declaring fasts, turning to God in time of prayer to consider additional examples. Esther, before her going to the king, declares 3 days of fasting. In the history of Hanukkah, the Maccabees also declared fast days before going out to battle.
It's interesting you mentioned Hanukkah, because I'm thinking to myself, will this war end by Hanukkah? I really hope so. Or shall we go further on? I know you will say.
Only God knows, of course.
I know,
yes.
Yeah. But I mean, it would be a good way to think that by Hanukkah we would have a lighter and a brighter day.
Yes, but we always have to be careful not to build up hopes that are unrealistic. This is clearly, barring an extraordinary miracle, which we always hope for, but which God hasn't guaranteed, is a long grind.
And of course, we see the situation with the hostages. Now it's more than a month that these people have been in dungeons of Hamas without any opportunity to see the sunlight, have a fresh breath of air.
Get a visit from the International Red Cross?
Red Cross, their own loved ones. It's heartbreaking. So how do we pray?
How do we pray? The whole question of prayer, fasting, turning to God, of course, is a profound one. And I feel compelled, since you mentioned the fasting, to first draw our attention to what fasting entails. As Isaiah tells us in God's name in chapter 58, it's not a matter of simply refraining from food and drink, but the concern for those who are in need, to emulate God, who is the ultimate giver, by our engaging in acts of giving to those who are less fortunate than we. That's also part of the fast, part of the prayer. That is the engagement in the good deeds that lift up ourselves and the world to a higher spiritual plane and reconnect us with God.
Doesn't this also mention that God sees Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem as the house of prayer for all the nations?
Absolutely.
So
absolutely.
here we have all the nations.
And indeed, and this is, of course, a crucial theme. I think we may have mentioned this last time as well. That is in Isaiah chapter 56, and of course these words are explicitly, specifically addressed to Bnei HaNechar, the children of the alien, who accompany God to serve Him, to love the name of the Lord, to be His servants. I will bring them to my holy mountain and gladden them in my house of prayer. Their offerings will be favored upon my altar, because my house will be called a house of prayer for all peoples. That message, of course, coming from here, from Jerusalem, just a few steps away from the Temple Mount, the house of prayer for all peoples, is of course especially germane to us all.
But we also saw some pictures of the Western Wall Plaza up until the Dung Gate was filled with people. It's like 100,000 people did pray.
You know, this brings back memories to me, bittersweet memories, perhaps more bitter than sweet. But I still vividly recall when Saddam Hussein attacked Israel with the Scuds in the first Gulf War.
Right.
On the eve of the attack, because we knew the attack was impending, and Israel's hands were tied, because the United States was very adamant that Israel should not intervene because it was liable to disrupt the alliance that the United States was attempting to forge in the Arab world. There was a day of prayer declared at the Western Wall. I still remember going with my oldest son, who at the time was, I guess, a little bit past age 5. And at some point, I was really getting worried, because the density of people was such that, a little kid, I was getting concerned for his welfare. I think at some point I just picked him up and held him in my arms, because I was afraid that he was just not big enough to be able to be safe in such a crowd. But the crowd itself was unequivocally an inspiration. The circumstances were terrible, but the crowd calling out to God as one was certainly an inspiration.
Was it 39 Scud rockets that hit us on 1991?
I think that was the number.
Right,
and miraculously.
Miraculously?
I believe there was one casualty.
Of a heart attack?
But other than that, the extraordinary gift of God's protection.
The keeper of Israel will never slumber nor sleep.
Right. But of course, and it pains me to say this, that doesn't provide us with any facile guarantee. We are unequivocally guaranteed that God can answer, that God does answer, but the nature of that answer, of course, is His domain, His decision, and we must necessarily defer to His judgment.
Now, coming back to these days in 1991, was it the chief rabbi then, chief rabbis, or that called for this prayer?
As I recall, yes. And I should also note that the choice of yesterday as the day of prayer is something that is deeply embedded in our tradition as well, because while some of you may think of it as, well, that was October 7th, and this time it was November 6th, in our tradition, in the reckoning of the Hebrew months, it was the 22nd day of Tishrei that the terrible massacre was perpetrated and the hostages were kidnapped. And there is a powerful significance in our tradition for the Shloshim, the 30th day. The 30th day after someone has left this world is a day in which all those who were close to him gather together for prayers in his memory. And likewise, of course, with respect to anything, the 30-day period is one that has profound significance in our tradition. Yesterday was the 30th day.
I see. I think that there is a real need that the people of Israel will unite and pray together. And of course, we want to see the house of prayer being filled also with all the other nations. Absolutely. I saw a lot of response yesterday. Many people were joining in prayer yesterday.
You know, the tradition of, in time of distress, turning to God in prayer and fasting and, of course, good deeds is not by any means an exclusively Jewish one. Consider the thrust of the 3rd chapter of the book of Jonah. That is the people of Nineveh. The king of Nineveh ordains fasting and praying. They called upon God powerfully, the Bible reads. And they put away all the evil deeds that they had been doing in order to return to God. So that's certainly something that we see as an international tradition.
It's quite powerful to see the power of prayer. And yet it takes humility from our leaders to say we need God's help.
Absolutely. And I think that's the first, perhaps most indispensable prerequisite of being able to get started in this entire process. On that plane, I must share with you that it has been a profound encouragement for me and my wife and many others that when we hear in the news, almost all of our leaders explicitly invoke God's name, and not just occasionally, but relentlessly. Speaking about, with God's help, we will prevail. With God's help, we hope to attain the victory, but to realize that ultimately everything is under God's aegis and God's sovereignty and God's providence.
It is indeed powerful to see how many times our leaders have been using the scriptures and quoting the Psalms, and it is so needed also to unite the people.
Just to stress, it's not just the leaders, maybe far more so than the leaders, the people.
Exactly.
There's been such a, it pains me to put it in these terms, but there's been such a profound religious revival that has taken place in the wake of this unprovoked attack. And this is, of course, in a context in which we appreciate that only a little bit less than 2 weeks earlier, we encountered terrible divisiveness, also with respect to praying to God, even on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement. And the reaction of coming together, first of all, overcoming the divisions that had sundered our society, but in particular also returning to God, returning to our spiritual roots. This unequivocally has been a profound reawakening, revival that has taken place in Israel.
Well, house divided, kingdom divided will fall. And this is what our enemies were hoping, and they didn't expect that Israel will come back to be one body again, one nation again under God.
They served unwittingly as the means to bring us back together again. And of course, that was not their aim. They aimed to exploit these divisions, but obviously, again, while we're certainly not coming to provide any facile explanations of the terrible carnage that we experienced and the inexpressible human suffering that resulted, we see that things are unfolding in a manner that is unequivocally the diametric opposite of what they had in mind.
Right. Again, there were reports then in these recordings that terrorists actually recorded on their GoPro cameras and so on and so forth was Farsi was heard. and the dialects of Arabic that were not local were heard. So there were many people that pointed it out that it was a concerted attack of very many ISIS-like elements that have been smuggled in here, smuggled into Gaza.
Well, I read that in the most current report on the subject, far more current than any newspapers, in the Bible. That is the battle waged by the nations, as we've discussed. The battle of Gog and Magog in Ezekiel in chapter 38, that explicitly, of course, includes in the Hebrew Paras, that's Persia, that's Iran, but more generally includes a whole motley assortment of nations that have come to do battle with God. And likewise in Zechariah chapter 14, when it is the nations that are coming to do battle against God in Jerusalem. So we know that the wicked unite perversely to do battle against God and his people.
Well, then there is also this scriptures of Isaiah 17 about Damascus being removed as a city and people being removed from that area. And then again, masses of people coming against Israel. In the evening there is trouble, and in the morning they are no more. Yeah. So there are many, many examples, of course, of things that we still haven't seen.
Right, and of course we're not attempting to give God a timetable, so to speak. We are noting that he has given us the words of consolation in the book of books. The consolation comes not because we know the game plan and we know what the end story is going to be on a certain date. We know the end story. We just don't know the date. And more than anything else, we know that he's in control.
But it's interesting to see how a situation like this that we experience now can develop into something, implications going all over the world. I mean, I'm hearing from Germany, for example, how difficult it is for Germans to cope with these Muslim gangs that are taking over. In Sweden, children at school tell other children Israel has to be erased. I mean, it's something that somehow kind of has moved its tentacles all over the world. Also, this evil has been stirred up, and I think it's a big warning to the whole world.
It's undoubtedly a warning to the world. It is, to me, from my perspective, just further corroboration that this isn't something that is merely happening, happenstance, but something that fits into a vast divine plan that is unfolding. And again, we know the end of the story. We don't know how many chapters lie between the present and that conclusion of the story, but I think it's impossible to contemplate the enormity of what is taking place without appreciating that this is something that figures in God's plan.
And again, I mean, Israel seems to divide the whole world's opinion. I mean, we see the polarization. I mentioned all of these leaders that came for the solidarity visits. We see the other leaders that are declaring their war threats towards Israel. I mean, Turkey. Yeah. I mean, Erdogan and of course Iran has been doing this for years. And so we see how time after time after time the nations are called, to the valley of Jehoshaphat we read for a judgment. And I mean, again, even in 1947 UN vote, right?
Yes.
We had 39 nations voting for, 13 against. Yeah. And do we see anything good happening in these 13 nations that voted against? Not stable democracies or certainly prosperous life. I mean, it's been a horrible dictatorships and poverty and curse, really.
But with respect to Israel being the dividing line, I think we've discussed this analogy in the past, that the way I describe it is Israel is the canary in the coal mine. For those who aren't familiar with what a canary is doing in a coal mine, in the old days, miners would take a canary into the mines, because a canary is, of course, a songbird, so it'd be singing. But a canary is also a very sensitive creature. And if there would be toxic fumes accumulating in the mine, then the canaries would die and stop singing. So the canary in the coal mine is an exceedingly sensitive gauge of ambient toxicity. Israel is the canary in the coal mine. That is, we'll keep on singing as long as God enables us to do so, but it serves as a gauge of the toxic fumes of godlessness in the world. And perhaps the most apt passage to cite here is when we read in Psalm 83, your enemies, O Lord, are murmuring. Those who hate you have lifted up the head. And how does that express itself? With respect to your people, they engage in secret counsel and seek counsel over those whom you have vouchsafed. And to be more explicit with respect to who are your people, they said, let us eradicate them from being a nation, that the name Israel will never be mentioned again. And again, they have taken counsel themselves, but ultimately it is counsel against you. It is those who are your enemies, those who hate you. Those who hate God hate Israel. That's not to imply that we're perfect. We aren't God's ambassadors on earth, but God sent us into the world with a mission. And as Reverend Flannery of the National Council of Churches in the United States, a Catholic cleric, expressed it. This was a citation in the New York Times, I believe, from the 1970s. Israel bequeathed to the world God's moral law, and for that, Israel has never been forgiven.
Wow. Well, we have been, discussing with your colleague, Rabbi Adlerstein, about the fact that Pope, at this time, failed to condemn Hamas, failed to demand the refugees, the hostages to be freed, and instead demands that Israel would stop the war. And it is so unfortunate, again, to see the Holocaust repeat. For me, what happened on October 7, it was like we were confronted with these atrocities of the Holocaust. Yes. Seeing the children, seeing the women, seeing the, beheaded babies. It's like you cannot imagine. Yeah. And then the very same type of an attitude, blaming Israel. The UN secretary saying these things that shouldn't be even repeated, blaming Israel.
Who would have thought that it were possible? That is, the truth is, it is a memorable observation of the high commander of the Allied forces at the end of World War II, Dwight David Eisenhower, who upon seeing the concentration camps, ordered the press photographers to take newsreels, to take pictures, and he said, because the day will come that people will deny this. And we need the documentation so everyone will be able to know it's a lie. That is, the denial is a lie, that this all indeed happened. And it's in that regard, when we speak of the division among the nations, I think we've discussed this as well, it's not just a division among nations. It's a division that strikes even within families, because, thank God, we live in the information age. It's a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing to have access to the information. Everyone has access to the information. It's a curse for those who choose to ignore the truth and side with the forces of evil. They'll have no excuses. The information was there. In bygone eras, we were dependent upon the official conduits of news, if there was any news at all, and people succumbed to the most primitive biases. Now all the information is there. Everyone is empowered to choose. I know I naively thought, after the enormity, the obscenity of the carnage, well, this time there isn't going to be any debate on the subject. And the fact that after such obscene atrocities, there are those who are still prepared to turn a blind eye to it all and to consider Israel the aggressor is the most demonstrative proof that facts are not at all relevant to them.
Well, we are, of course, here to talk to our allies, to give answers to our allies. And we're so thankful that you have been standing with us. There's been demonstrations and prayer meetings, and I would ask you to continue to do that. It's going to be a long run. It's going to be many prayer meetings and a lot of times to stand before God and pray. And as we are here today at the Friends of Zion Museum, we want to just encourage you, be encouraged to take more time for prayer. Rabbi, what would you say as a final thought? What it would be the right focus? How should our friends pray for Israel in this time?
I think the first observation to make, maybe the most essential, is the realization that prayer, more than anything else, is a gift. That is, as expressed by Moses speaking to Israel in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 7, what great nation is there to whom God is close, like God our Lord, whenever we call out to him? And whenever we call out to him, of course, isn't exclusively for Israel. We already noted the message of the people of Nineveh in Jonah chapter 3, calling out to God in earnest, and the evil decree that had been decreed upon Nineveh was averted, not just because of the prayer, but because of that process of inner transformation in which they had engaged.
Also Solomon, with the temple dedication, he says, if my people, actually it is God answering him his prayers, if my people who is called by my name humbles themselves and turns from their wicked ways, I will hear from heaven and I will heal their land. And we need this healing in Israel so much. And it's also a promise that was given by Solomon's prayer. He said that even if a foreigner will come and pray towards Jerusalem.
Not even if, especially.
Especially.
That is, there's a special dimension of prayer that we really need to discern in King Solomon's prayer of dedication for the Holy Temple, in which, ironically, he doesn't say anything about the temple service. He speaks exclusively about prayer. And I think, if I make a suggestion, there's so much more to speak about with respect to prayer. Maybe that should be a separate episode, because we have so much more to talk about.
Well, we need to do this definitely, as our time has now come to an end.
Okay.
Thank you so much for being with us, Rabbi.
Thank you, and God bless you all.
And we just want to encourage you to tune in every day, 1 o'clock Jerusalem time, and hear from us the answers for our allies. So remember, those who pray for the peace of Jerusalem will prosper, and those who bless the seed of Abraham will be blessed.